demand. The demand is still very strong that the supply of democracy from local actors, from the leadership, has actually was over. The period of personal rule, of resistance to term limits, which we thought over by now, has unfortunately begun to rear its head again. We see long-serving rulers who initially whose confidence were shaken in the early 1990s and early 2000s, who we felt were demoralized. Some of whose colleagues had been toppled through democratic people's power are basically showing a resurgence. We've seen attempts to prolong term limits, to undo term limits, and we have even seen a return to coup d'etat in West Africa. So there are signs that the last 30 years the picture has been quite mixed. So this is a moment for us for stock taking, just to take stock, see where we have faltered, if we have faltered at all, where we have faltered and why. Why have the hopes that welcomed democracy, why have the expectations with which we all welcomed the democratic project, why have those expectations and hopes not been fulfilled? And we thought that the concept of democracy capture would provide us the right framework, an appropriate framework within which to discuss this subject. So together with Open Societies Africa region, we at CDD-Ghana put together a program beginning with some research. So we commissioned various country experts in 6 selected African countries, in Mozambique, Malawi, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and Benin, to look into the subject of democracy capture as they find it in their various countries. And we were delighted that Adriano and Center, our namesake in Mozambique, the Center for Democracy and Development, took up the task of doing the paper and the research on the Mozambican case to look into the subject of democracy capture. Has democracy been captured? Is that why the expected fruits of democracy have not materialized for the people? Is that why the expectations with respect to political and civil liberties, expectations with respect to economic development and social improvement have not yet to materialize for the vast majority of African people? So that is the subject that brings us here today. And I, like you, I am very eager to listen to the Mozambican story. We have had a session with various country experts from Kenya, from Ghana, and others in Accra in the last couple of weeks. And it does appear that the picture that is evolving from these various countries is that there may indeed be something called democracy capture happening on the continent. So this is how we come to this conversation this afternoon. And I'm really delighted to have Professor Adriano, who needs no introduction, an expert on the subject, certainly from the Mozambican case, to be really sharing the perspectives from Mozambique. And at the end of the project, the idea is that we will compare these countries' case studies and see if there is an overarching theme, if there is a common narrative that emerges out of that. And the hope is that we could then possibly develop an index called Africa Democracy Capture Index, to measure this phenomenon of democracy capture over time and see to what end civil society, academia, together with the various regional bodies in Africa, to what extent we could use this new index to basically inform policy reform at the continental, subcontinental, and national levels in order to rescue democracy from the captors, if indeed it has been captured. So that's the general idea of this discussion. And without much ado, I think I would leave. I would go back to Dr. Moyo, the moderator, and join the listeners and listen attentively to what Professor Adriano has to present to us from Mozambique. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Prempeh, for those opening remarks, and for laying the ground for fertile discussion on the issues of democracy capture in Africa. Now, colleagues, Africa, allow me to invite a friend, a neighbor. I am in Zimbabwe. I am a Zimbabwean. So Mozambique is our neighbor. And I want to invite a colleague to engage on the subject. And I hope he will also tell us about state capture. Over the past few years, we have had the concept of state capture, particularly emerging from Mozambique. What's the difference between state capture and democracy capture, maybe the fiscal capture, as we are beginning to see these issues on the table for discussion. The colleague that I am inviting to present to us now is a man who needs no introduction at all, a courageous man, a courageous scholar, a public intellectual, who is the director of CCD Mozambique. He teaches at the University of Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo. He chairs a number of institutions, human rights institutions, networks of human rights defenders. He chairs a lot of those. And his name is none other than Professor Adriano Alfredo Nuvunga. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. Thank you very much, Professor Prempeh, for this opportunity to be part of this initiative. It's an honor to be here today to share. Okay, that's okay. Okay. Yeah. So yes, democracy capture in Mozambique and its implications on human rights defending. I will take you through the paths of democracy capture, differentiating it from state capture and what that means in the context of Mozambique, and then look at the implications for human rights defending. To start with, I'll take you through the concept of the state, and I will use the concept of the German sociologist Max Weber, who defined the state as a polity that maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So Mozambique is a state since 25th June 1975, the day that the independence was declared after the defeat of the colonial rule, from the Portuguese colonial rule. Mozambique embarked on a one-party state, and only 2 years later, a civil war was starting, worked by Renamo, which was the then the rebel movement, and this 16-year, this civil war took 16 years. Then towards late 80s, the Frelimu one-party state started a democratic opening, and that democratic opening was initiated with the economic liberalization, and this liberalization resulted in the sale of the state parastatals and the creation of the private sector. So the private sector was a political decision to create it, and the state moving away from the economic activity, and later Frelimu abandoned the socialist ideology, and in 1990 the Frelimu one-party parliament passed the constitution that lifted the ban on the political parties and defined elections as the mechanism for political parties to win political power. The country was still at a civil war. Between 1990 and 1992, there were peace talks in Rome, Italy, for the end of the war. In that context, in between, the so-called non-armed political parties emerged. The country was still at war, and though Renamo at the time had strong military muscle, but the reality is that Frelimu resulted controlling the peace process. And in 1992, October 4, 1992, the peace deal was reached, and Frelimu kept control of the state. It liberated, it established and controlled. Then followed a 2 years democratic transition between 1990 until the democracy founding election in December 1994. In between, there were attempts and they were push for a transition government similar to the South African model, when after the release of Mandela until the April 1994 election, there was a transition government. Here, that was not allowed by Frelimu. So this was the very first opportunity for Frelimu to regain control of the state it claimed owning it, because it had fought for the liberation struggle. On the other hand, Renamo was claiming the fatherhood of democracy, because it had fought the one-party Frelimo state, but it did not have the means to impose that. So it was in this context that the state moved into the democratic transition. The democracy founding elections in 1994 were held. That election, it was a peculiar election, because if a first past the post system was used in that election, the former rebel movement would have won the parliamentary majority. Mozambique has a proportional system with a presidential election and legislative election separately, the same day. So Frelimo secured the presidency, but if first past the post was used for legislative election, the then rebel movement would have won the parliament majority. But since it was the system is proportional, Frelimo secured both the presidency and the legislative election. That was a critical moment. That election was run by the UN mission to Mozambique, and it was fairly free and fair election. Then, after that election, there were calls also for a unity government. President Shisanu, he did not accept the calls for a unity government. So again, the opposition was denied access to the state. Remember I said, in the transition, democratic transition, the rebel movement was denied possibility of direct participation, since there was no a transition government. Again, here it was denied. In these two occasions, Frelimo took the chance to consolidate its state. In 1999, the second election was held. That election was the most vibrant election in the 30 years of Mozambique's democracy. Turnout was top, was high, and only electoral fraud prevented the former rebel movement from winning the presidency. And having succeeded in retaining power, in retaining presidency and the parliament majority, subsequent Frelimo governments realized how strong, how rooted the former rebel movement were in the country, particularly in the central part of the country, with Frelimo controlling the extreme north and the extreme south of the country. Then Frelimo government started state reforms aimed at further strengthening the control, their grip on the state. And what was really clear is that with President Shisanu retaining his second term in 1999 until 1994, what was clear is that under President Shisanu, in the 10 years of democratic rule by President Shisanu, there was conceptually what we can call state capture, which is a type of a systemic political corruption in which private interests significantly influence the state's decision-making processes to their own advantage. And that state capture had to do with the fact that Mozambique's private sector, as I have said, it's a Frelimo creation, and it remained highly dependent on Frelimo governance, and it saw Frelimo's continuation in power as its way of survival. So it was, and it still is, what we call more tenderpreneurs, depending on governance, on political governance, to remain as private sector. So you do not have an autonomous private sector which is independent from the state and from the ruling elite that could play an important role of sustaining democratic vibrance. This lasted until 2004. As of 2004 onwards, with the coming of President Gebuza, by that time, Mozambique could be labeled as a vibrant two-party system. It is a vibrant two-party system. Remember I said in the democracy founding election in 1994, the opposition could have won parliament majority if the first past the post system was used. Two, I said, only fraud prevented the former rebel movement from winning the presidential election at least. So that meant 10 years of vibrant two-party system. With President Gebuza in power, he moved then. He moved towards, from state capture, as I've said, to a democracy capture. A democracy capture. What that means in the Mozambican context, that meant political control of institutions of electoral governance, to remove the uncertainty inherent to electoral outcomes. So since President Gebuza came to power, we started to see the politicization of institutions, particularly of the electoral governance institution. The electoral governance institutions, they have to ensure a certainty procedural, a procedural certainty of the processes of electoral administration, to make sure that there is uncertain when it comes to electoral outcome. It shouldn't be certain about who will win before the outcome. But since President Gebuza came to power, that started to be the case. So the uncertainty which underpinned the vibrancy two-part system I've talked about, that was dealt with, was moved away. Second, there was a move to the framework of a developmental state with clear control the distribution process as to who gets what. That was a clear control as to who gets what, not only in terms of policy outcomes, but also in terms of access to institutions. So in reality, under President Gebuza, although Mozambique remained a rule of law with one of the most progressist constitutions, and although Mozambique is praised internationally for regularly conducting elections, the reality is that Frelimo sets what is permissible and what it is not permissible in society. So in reality, Frelimo is kind of above the Constitution. It's kind of above the Constitution, setting, as I've said, what is permissible and what it is not permissible. With this happening, while opposition were denied access to the state, they were excluded from contestation with elections rigged. Remember, I've said that with President Gebuza, the uncertainty inherent to democratic processes, it was stopped. Independent and active civil society actors, they were delegitimized and labeled as foreign hand. The very same state that was highly aid dependent, it could still look at civil society actors that were supported by the very same donors that supported government, but still government could delegitimize civil society players, actors. This was the governance under President Gebuza. But there was a dramatic shift as of 2015. And what happened as of 2015? Since the coming of the current president, President Nyusi, is a capture within the Frelimo capture the democracy. So we have a capture within a capture, which is characterized by factionalism within Frelimo, with a clear control of the party by the veterans stopped. So President Gebuza was the last veteran to lead the party. That was stopped. And so now there is the vast political Frelimo, which is a dominant political party. If you look at the concept of party dominance, Frelimo is clearly a dominant, more hegemonic than dominance, because the electoral numbers, they do not necessarily substantiate that, and particularly the aspect of fraudulent elections. So it's a more hegemonic than dominance, but still it is there. But as of 2015, you see a subset of Frelimo capturing it from the larger family of Frelimo. And as I've said, the characteristics include one, the veterans put at bay, defenders, human rights defenders, not only are being delegitimized, are being harassed, but they're being killed. Defenders are being killed. Prominent human rights defenders are being killed. And others are being harassed, are being beaten up, are being taken to all sorts of places. And only a few days later, they will be seen again. They are shot. And election is so fraudulent that is more important from the procurement opportunity. So election, it has become a procurement opportunity. It's an opportunity for corruption. And this, in our view, marks not only the end of the third wave of liberalization in the continent and its claims to advance freedoms, rights, including development, but it challenges the notion of Weberian state. So it is not only the end of the third wave of liberalization, but it's also the challenge of the Weberian notion of the state. In the African and the Mozambican context, democracy capture is, I would say that is the negation of democratic development and participation, and also of the negation of institutional development, which are the mechanisms for people-centered governance and the possibility of shared prosperity. Developed nations, they channel growth to people through institutions. In captured democracies, those institutions, they cease to operate and they are substituted by people. So in societies where defenders are being harassed and are victims of politically sponsored killings, where parts of the population are marginalized for political motivations, and development is conditioned to political support, that democracy is partly failed. It's partly failed. So what I'm saying here is, in the context of Mozambique, democracy capture, that means the negation of the means for development, the means for political participation. And those are the key objectives, or were the key objectives of the third wave of liberalization. With that happening, we can say, using the concept of state failure from Zartman, that although some of the key functions of the state machinery are active, but other aspects of that, they're clearly failing. So what I'm saying here to conclude is that in Mozambique, we have a democracy capture within a capture, in a more broad capture, and that is distinct from the narrow concept of state capture, which is a control of the policy processes by private sector interest groups. But it allows the key mechanisms of democracy to operate. But in the case of state of democracy capture, that means not only to negate the democratic participation to groups, but it negates the essence of democracy, not only in developmental terms to parts of the population, but also to democracy as an institution of advancement of political rights to the people. I would, for the moment, leave it there. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share these findings. Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you, Prof. You have raised fundamental issues. You have raised the issue that really struck a note with me, the capture within a capture. The story of Mozambique is a tragic story, but apparently it is a story that runs parallel to what is happening in Zimbabwe. And I want to put on the table, as you take a breather, for you to reflect, and perhaps you will come back as I put on the table 3-4 issues that I think are similar between Zimbabwe and Mozambique, perhaps the rest of the of the continent. One of the things that I want to put on the table is the state within and the capture within the capture. In Zimbabwe, of the political leadership that is also involved in business. Do we have that in Mozambique? Do we have that in Ghana, Professor Prempeh, where the political leadership itself, the presidium, is actually involved in business? Number two, the military, as part of state capture, democracy capture, what is the role of the military? In Zimbabwe, we have a situation where by the military, I call them the militarisans. They are not just the military officials or military hierarchy, but they're involved in business. And they've also participated in the capture of the state, capture of democracy. And we have a situation which I call the executive military alliance. Do we have that in Mozambique? What role is the military playing? Is it playing a role like it is playing in Zimbabwe and elsewhere in Africa? I put on the table the question, perhaps for our listeners, or our participants, our viewers, what role is China playing in this? Is there any role for Beijing? Is Beijing catapulting the problem of democracy capture, because they don't believe in democracy as we know it, liberal democracy, and yet there is a massive presence of the Chinese interest, geopolitical and geoeconomic interest in our continent, in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and elsewhere in the world. Is there any implications to democracy capture because of the presence of the Chinese interests in the continent and in Mozambique? What about COVID? In Zimbabwe, we are seeing the weaponization of COVID-19, where the state is using lockdown measures to clamp down on human rights defenders, on media, on journalists, on civic society, on various public scholars, public intellectuals, critics, and so there is weaponization of COVID, thereby increasing the intensity of capturing democracy across the continent. Do you see that in Mozambique and elsewhere? Colleagues, it's now open. If people have questions, comments, reflections on the story of Mozambique and the issue or the problem of democracy capture is concerned, is now open, and I would like those that are helping me, our technical people, to help me to get the questions on the table.
Prof. Prempeh, want to come in?
Sure. Thank you.
After you.
Thank you for those very enlightening remarks, perspectives from Mozambique. When we decided to include, when we settled on the country case studies, we wanted basically to have a sample of countries with diverse histories and diverse journeys to democracy. And in Mozambique, we found one country that was coming from the freedom fighter history, liberation movement history. We could have chosen Zimbabwe. We could have chosen, I guess, Angola. But so I'm happy that Dr. Moyo is also here and trying to make parallels with Zimbabwe. But just listening to you, in terms of the path to democratization, is it hopeless for? Do you think that is the project hopeless for a country that is coming to democratization from the liberation movement history and trajectory, where at the point of the transition to democracy, you had an entrenched, party from the liberation movement era being the party essentially in place. Even though in Mozambique's case, yes, you had civil war and you had Renamo and others, but is the trajectory just hopeless when you come from that background, as opposed to, say, coming from a coup d'etat? Say in West Africa, most of the countries had experienced mostly coup d'etats. So we have soldiers coming into politics intermittently and going back in Ghana, in Niger, in Mali, in Benin, in Nigeria. That has been our history. And we see that in those countries where you have a history of intermittent military takeover or coups d'etat, it seems fairly, democratic transitions have been easier there when you observe, maybe because we've had a series of experiences with soldiers in government and we've had enough fatigue with military rule and civilian rule alternating in that way. But at least there is hope there in the sense of at least being able to do alternation in power, being able to have competitive elections in those scenarios. Is it totally hopeless in the Mozambiques and the Zimbabwe's? Well, maybe not quite Zimbabwe, but Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, coming from that kind of a history of liberation movement? Or am I extrapolating too much from that Mozambique experience? Is it uniquely Mozambique, or you think that the problem that you identify can be shared with all of the others from the similar history of liberation movement or liberation struggle?
Over you to Prof. The question before you is...
Yes?
There is a direct question to you, which says, is the experiences of Mozambique, are they peculiar? Tell us.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you very much for that, and it is good. And I told you, Prof. Prempeh, that it is good to listen to the trajectories of democratic development in this part of the world, which has experienced liberation movements. The liberation movements are animals on their own. In West Africa, you don't have that. Your question to me is whether what I have talked about here or what I have described as Mozambique trajectory, is it peculiar to Mozambique, or it can be kind of generalized to Southern African countries that have liberation movements with a liberation struggle. It's a liberation struggle. Countries, Mozambique with Frelimo, Zimbabwe with ZANU-PF, Botswana with BDP, although without liberation struggle, Namibia with SWAP, South Africa with the ANC, Angola with the MPLA. So your question is, what I'm saying here, it can be also seen in those countries. There are so many things that are different, but the fundamentals, the mindset of the veterans of liberation struggle, it is the same. They might use different instruments depending on the political economy of those particular countries. Give an example, Mozambique is unique in that Mozambique and Angola, they are more equal in that. They share the same colonial master. number one. And the colonial master has shaped the nature of the liberation struggle depending on the political developments in Portugal, but also depending on the level of socio-economic and political development. So, and these people come from the same schools. But although there is that particularity, but they are the same. They are the same. And as I've said, the instruments of party control, they are shaped by the dynamics, by domestic dynamics, by the nature of political economies, of governance, of those particular polities. But the reality is that these people, they have the same mindset. Look at SADC. Look at how they have shaped SADC. Look how they have shaped SADC as the institution that is increasingly being seen as a club of friends, and the club of these former countries from the Ring of the Friend. So what I'm saying here is that they are the same, they are different, they have peculiarities, but they're the same in terms of mindset. In terms of mindset towards political control. You could hear Zuma saying the ANC would rule South Africa until Jesus comes back. That is the very same mentality everywhere that these countries, and Mugabe would say the same. And also these people, they are friends. They were in the same camps in Tanzania. They were in the same camps in Algeria. So they know each other. They are friends. They share tactics. They share instruments. The objective is to retain the control of the state that they claim to have liberated, to have built, and they control. The objective is to deny that access. So delegitimation, staying above the constitution and setting the rule of what is right and wrong, that is the key. When you go to South Africa, you go to Zimbabwe, they will say you are born free. It is the same here. President Gebuza would ask me, where were you in 69? I said it was before I was born. So he said, thank you. So from where do you get the legitimacy to say these critical things to me? Because you were not there in 6 so when we were crossing that river with crocodiles. So why? You are born free. That is the same language. That is the same instrument they use to delegitimate the youth. Now, they delegitimate the youth now to remain in power, to control the instruments. And they are ready to go that extra mile as long as they stay in power. The key objective now, it becomes retaining power at all costs. Okay. So this is something that it can be generalized. And of course, there are peculiarities. Now, the question is, Dr. Moyo, my good friend, Dr. Moyo, I'm laughing because Mozambique and Zimbabwe, they share most of these tragedies and some of these tragedies. When I was growing up, going to Harare, it was more luxurious than going to Pretoria. Going to Harare, it was more luxurious than going to Pretoria. Yes, that was the situation. But look at the situation now. And some of the problems that our countries are facing, they are self-inflicted. And this self-inflicting, it speaks to the mindset of the liberators. To the mindset of the liberators. But okay, let me go to the questions. This issue of the capture within capture. Yes, you have this capture within capture. And that means in the context of Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, and Angola, it speaks to how these former liberal movements today, they have moved away from the ideals of the liberation struggle. Capture within capture means the distance which these movements are today in relation to the ideals of the liberation struggle. So here in Mozambique, the former president Gebuza, he was Mr. Gebusiness. Mr. Gebusiness. Mozambique would today be eyeing a middle-income country, would be eyeing a middle-income country with increased human development if President Gebuza had not taken these tragic decisions, his tragic policies, underpinned by corruption, underpinned by corruption. So it was not only being involved or engaged in business, but it was the use of the state in a way that it became the colony, the presidential colony. So there's a distinction there. Mozambique is where it is today because President Gebuza and his group, they have taken tragic decisions, and those decisions were not developmental. They were corruption-driven. They were not developmental, they were corruption-driven. And this brings me to your second question, the role of the army. When I was growing up, the army, it was a prestigious institution. It was a prestigious institution. But today, it is corrupted. Its mandate of protecting independence and sovereignty of the state is corrupted. Now, the military is in business. The $2 billion illegal debt, odious debt, it was spearheaded by the army. That's a pure corruption which has ruined the country. And do you know why that was allowed? It's because the top leaders, they have taken their share. So then the army, which are a vital army in the vital army of the state in post colonial societies, it has to be given also its share. And that it had to come. But I hear you, in Zimbabwe, you have issues, but not the type of that we have here. Because the Gebuza regime, it went overseas to borrow outside the framework of the constitution against the future revenues of oil and gas activities in the north. So it is not only taking from the present, it is also taking from the future. So it is not only milking the present, it's also milking the future. And our children, they will have to pay that. This is the mindset. So the military, and now we have a problem in northern Mozambique, as you know. We are facing an insurgency in northern Mozambique, as you know. And guess what? The state has no the capacity to face the insurgency there. They want to bring mercenary companies to fight for sovereignty, to protect our independence, to bring mercenary companies. Because they have diverted the state capacity that was meant to modernize the army to private pockets, to private pockets, to private pockets. So this is the situation now. It's a tragic story. It's a tragic story. Mozambique is in bankruptcy. You talked about COVID-19. When COVID-19 became a big issue worldwide, in Mozambique in particular, Mozambique was in fiscal distress, debt distress, that could not do anything. So this is one. They could not do anything to face COVID because over the years, corruption, including by the military institution, it has prevented the state from investing in social areas, healthy, education, yes, public health, it's about education. They have failed to invest in those sectors, particularly social protection, because of corruption. Then COVID hit us. There was no money. They quickly went to the IMF, borrowing. And borrowing against future revenues. Borrowing against future revenues. The IMF quickly gave the money. Mozambique has gas, as well the gas reserves. So you can give them money. But where that money is now, not only COVID is being weaponized in terms of further shrinking the space, the civic space, and targeting defenders, but more importantly, money is stolen. Corruption. Corruption. The procurement is a corruption procurement. Elitist corruption procurement. So not only they have prevented the state from investing in key sectors, but importantly now, the very small funding out there, it was stolen by the elites. It was stolen by the elites. You see the corruption number, the COVID numbers, they're peaking. And the abuse of human rights, the targeting of defenders, those who are exposing corruption. What you have with Shinono in Zimbabwe, we have it here. Those who expose corruption with the COVID money, they are targeted. It is precisely 1 month that they threatened to bomb my house. To bomb my house. This is the reality. So not only COVID-19 is used to further shrink the civic space, cornering defenders, but that is instrumental for corruption to go unchecked. For corruption to go unchecked. Corruption with COVID money to go unchecked. So I think it is not good that you have your politicians in business, but I'm happy that they're in business than politicians here and the army here that they are not in business. We don't have business here. No. They are tenderpreneurs. They are tenderpreneurs. Ghost procurement, fake procurement. We have white elephants for money to go into the hands of those who have successfully captured Frelimo. So Frelimo now is the instrument that is captured by groups for extractivism. So I think, as you have said, COVID is being weaponized against defenders, but more importantly, it's being used by those who are in power, that they have invested money to capture the state. So investing to capture the state, it's a lucrative business. It's a lucrative business. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor. The story of Mozambique is depressing. The story of Africa is depressing because of the few individuals that are running the state, the political elite, destroying the hopes of the millions of Africans across the continent. As you take your water, I hear you as saying democracy captures and instruments include state resources, the people which is even broader than state. That's what I hear from you. I hear you say democracy capture is done through state security apparatus, and the story about you being threatened with the bombs, with arrest, with all sorts of threats is really depressing. Simply because you are a researcher, you are a human rights defender, you are a civil liberties person, and you want to see Africa do better, you want to see Mozambique prosper, then it becomes a crime to say that people don't want transparency, don't want accountability, and therefore the accountability campaign has become a problem to states. I hear you say that. I hear you say one of the tools of democracy capture is election. We do have elections. They are always carried out whenever they are due. Without fail, there are always elections, but those elections are mere rituals. They are only used as public relations programs for the political elite. That's what I hear from you. I want to say to Professor Kwasi, as Prempeh as we wait for other questions, if you are listening, Professor, currently we are seeing a global trend where democracy is actually going down. There is a democracy deconsolidation globally, democracy regression globally, where even big countries, your democracies in Europe and in the United States are questioning some norms and values of democracy. What do you say about this, and what chance do we have in Mozambique? And as you also started in West Africa, what chances do we have? How do we rehabilitate democracy? How do we rescue the democracy project in Africa, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, everywhere, when the rest of the world is also threatened, where democracy globally is threatened? Please, can I have your reflections,
Sure.
Professor Prempeh?
Yes. It's interesting. At the time that we and Open Society Afro started to talk about this project, and we conceived the idea of democracy capture, we really were not thinking of Africa or African democracy as a part of the global recession in democracy. In fact, we were operating really on the assumption at the time that Africa may well be the one case that was not actually following a global trend. While we had seen some reversals, the evidence on the ground, certainly on the demand side. So from Afrobarometer, we clearly saw that the demand side for democracy was very strong. So that gave us hope. And we had seen that even where incumbents were trying to basically reverse some of the gains from the third wave, that civil societies and others were really quite active in trying to fight back and push back and the like. But actually, since we started on this path, since we rolled out the project, the international environment has changed in the last couple of years, actually, even just in the last 2 years, certainly in the last 4. And now, so there was at a point when we thought we were moving towards, if not a continental, but at least towards some regional norms around term limits in West Africa. ECOWAS almost got close to actually installing term limits as one of the regional benchmarks for membership in the community. ECOWAS was active in getting Yahya Jammeh out. So we saw trends that were positive, even in the last 2-3 years. But in just during the same period, almost when we were celebrating, or at least were thinking that we were an exception, a small exception to this global trend, then we began to see things unraveling. And I think clearly the international environment matters a great deal. You mentioned China in your conversation in the question that you initially posed. And clearly, given the huge role that China now takes in African affairs and its kind of economic diplomacy, dealing mostly with, government to government, elite to elite kinds of transactional dealings with African leaders, very little dealings with civil society, almost no, at least in some of the Western countries, you have, civil society counterparts and peers in other countries you could actually compare notes with and deal with. It's not the case with the one prominent emerging superpower on the continent. I mean, the Chinese strategy has been essentially elite to elite, with very little connection to African civil societies or anything outside the leadership. So that is an interesting change in the environment. There's, if there are, there's democratic slippage in these countries, you are not going to see or hear any kind, or you can't go to China and expect any positive intervention except on behalf of the elite class. So that is an important change. And even from the West, that used to be, at least ideationally, used to be the lead supporter of this. I mean, you mentioned, we see the democratic recession in Europe coming initially from small states like Hungary and the like, but have become almost a wave. I mean, they've managed to hold the EU. Essentially, the EU has been almost unable to deal with the democratic backlash coming from the Polands and the Hungaries, and actually, in a way, you could say that they have actually succeeded in taming the EU's own appetite for supporting, democratic movements in other parts of the world. And of course, the US situation is what's on everybody's mind today, and it has been so in the last 4 years. So definitely the global environment, the international environment at the ideational level has been a bit hostile and has conspired with domestic elites' interest to really make the democratic project now a lot more difficult. You've seen with Brexit, you've seen the defunding. One should expect, the realignment of interest away from democracy and governance on the foreign policy side to economic interest on the UK side. One is going to see, for example, defunding of some of these civil society initiatives that have been supported, for example, by UK aid and the like. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and I think that this makes it even more opportune a time for us to have this conversation, because it really does mean that some of the initial assumptions that we went into the third wave with, which is that the international environment was supportive of democracy, because the third wave was the immediate post-Cold War period, that those assumptions may not hold, that domestic civil society groups could count on the support of pro-democracy movements outside of our own countries. That certainly is no longer true. I mean, and even things like term limits, when you see the recession in term limits have now become like a tactic that is used by long-serving African rulers not to bring their rulership to an end, but to prolong them. And when an influential country like China decides that they will, notwithstanding that being a one-party state, they will also do away with term limits at a time when we are struggling over these kinds of ideas, it certainly does not embolden people like you and myself and Adriano in the kind of work that we are trying to do in our own countries to beat elite attempts to reverse these gains. So clearly, I think there is definitely a connection. I mean, when the major international environment in which our democratic movements are situated begin to move in the opposite direction of democracy. Clearly, Africa can be expected to catch some cold. And therefore, I think this is really a difficult time, which really requires us to regroup, as we're doing, to go back to the drawing boards and see, what did we do wrong in the transition? Was it a transitional kind of strategic error? Did we rush too much, for example, in some countries to do elections? Knowing, for example, if you take, for example, the Egyptian example, right? Overthrowing Mubarak through people's power, but then not being ready to govern, so not organized enough to take the power, and then power then goes to whoever is ready to take it, and then immediately gets hijacked again by the military. Is that what happened? Should we have taken some time? Should we have gone through some process of interim constitutions and negotiated a better deal in the transition, even though it may have taken much longer? Is that what the lesson we are learning from this is? So even in the sequencing of reforms, what are the implications for sequencing reforms? What do we do, with countries that are trying to transition to democracy? I mean, it's, for example, in Mozambique, was the pact, the pact between, Renamo and others that brought an end to the war and Frelimo, was that the right moment to say, do elections? When you are not organized and the incumbent is entrenched, are there lessons to be learned that you are going to just walk into the hands of a hegemon who will then use democracy to legitimize what was before then illegitimate? So, I mean, there are important questions that are raised, and I think you've I cannot but agree with you that the international environment in which our current democratic projects are situated is shifting significantly against democracy, and that requires us then, those who are in favor of a democratization, to really rethink, relook our notes. And even within the continent, I mean, I think there's also, one must reckon the fact that the democracy versus development debate of the 1960s is back on the plate. If we thought that philosophical or ideational argument between democracy and development had been settled in favor of democracy, I think even within the continent, we see counterexamples of, leaders who are exactly projecting a developmental state ideology, Rwanda, Ethiopia, that are not necessarily buying the democracy story, right? And somehow, to the extent that they are able to deliver development that looks attractive, even if outside their countries more so than within, to the extent that people look and see, oh, but you go to Kigali, it is clean, the state appears to work, it's effective. You go to Addis and you're seeing changes going on. Is that kind of counterexample also not affecting the nature of the democracy debate in our own countries, especially educated African youth with access to the internet? When they see things in their country not working, when public services are not working, and they see that things are working in what is supposed to be an inferior democracy, or not quite a democracy in Rwanda, but if they see that this is working, does not also enter the equation and make the defense of democracy even more difficult? So I think there are a number of things going on, not just with China, with the new Africa superpower, but also with the general, international environment, the previous Western kind of democratic establishment, as well as on the continent itself, other countries emerging, so-called developmental states emerging, that are touting a different narrative. So you look at all these forces, and one cannot help but say that, yes, I mean, democracy is not the only game in town. It's not the end of history. I mean, on the African side of things, it is certainly not the end of history when you look at all these things. And therefore, I think it makes it even more imperative that we have this kind of conversation and use this occasion then to think through what the next steps must be, what reforms are necessary, whether we must reconceptualize the approaches to democracy, what does it mean for constitutional reform, what does it mean for sequencing of reform, what does it mean for standard setting at the continental and regional level in order to rescue the democracy project from the backlash that is obviously happening.
Hello, I'm sorry, I lost my question. I don't know where you are now.
Oh, sorry. We lost you.
I lost my connectivity for the past 10 minutes.
Sorry. I thought you were listening, quietly. But
No, I just lost my connectivity. Just smart part catch up.
Yeah. It seems that we have a colleague who wants to comment. Zanzana, could you please allow him to comment? It's from Mozambique.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I don't know if I will repeat the same question, because the last the Prof who spoke from Ghana, you talk about what I would like just to ask, but I will try to comment, and maybe Prof Nuvunga, you can give me some points on it. I'm from Mozambique, as Prof Nuvunga said. You spoke about the capture of state, but all about how the liberating parties lead our countries today, even from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, or South Africa, even in other countries. But maybe I would like to hear of you, maybe Mr. Nuvunga or Prof from Ghana, how can we save the democracy, but especially when we talk about young people, because we know that we have a demographic capacity in our continent, even though we are talking about a different context, yeah, we know, but how to save this democracy using this capacity, young people, as you said, Prof, when we are talking about social media and Facebook and other platforms, because on my point of view, I think that there are opportunities when we talk about young people today, even though, Prof, you said, for example, in Mozambique, we talk about young people and we try to alienate these people because of struggle in Mozambique and South Africa. But how to save this democracy using this demographic capacity? Because I think that we have something to do, we can do, and maybe is a time. Thank you.
Prof, would you want to go first? Nuvunga.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Tanzana, for the question. And yes, perhaps before that one, our moderator has asked the issue of the role of China in all this. I always said, and I keep saying, that China came at the time of fatigue. Remember that some 10 years ago, we were discussing the direct budget support. I mean, the Western nations, they were discussing the percentage of their GDP to be channeled as aid to developing countries. Dambisa Moyo at the same time was writing about the debt aid, and Dambisa Moyo was criticized for her book, but that book, in my view, is right. But at the same time, there was this fatigue by the African leaders with the conditionalities attached to aid from Accra to Busan, discussing direct budget support. It was all about conditionalities, and all these conditionalities had to do with good governance, free and fair elections, respect of human rights, and fight against corruption. These were the key issues. And there was some fatigue, and China was rising as a new global player, and it was it had greed when it comes to raw materials, and it came to China, it came to Africa, offering easy loans that they didn't need much, infrastructure oriented which was giving to the African leaders the instruments for political manipulation. So the Chinese sort of loans for infrastructure, they were having the same effects that windfall sort of income have on democracy. That the African leaders started to alienate the people and started to ignore the public, because their money, it was not coming from taxation, and also it was not coming from sources that demand that they have some conditionalities. So they started to behave like that. Look at Zambia today. Look at Mozambique today. And so many other African countries. But if you look at what the Chinese are taking away from Africa, you wonder whether African nations really need to entertain that unfair trade. What African nations are losing to China is 100 times more what they are gaining in poisonous debts from China. In poisonous debts from China. So it is failed leadership. It is failed leadership from our leaders that are entertaining this unfair trade. This unfair trade. The example of Mozambique, if you look at the statistics of what Mozambique claims to have exported to China, and what the Chinese statistics claim to have imported from Mozambique, it is 100 times different. 100 times different. And that it speaks to bad governance here in Africa and failed leadership. So China, yes, indeed, it is entertaining these models of democracy captures. And you capture democracy when you have money that you need not to account for, when you have money that comes from sources that they don't demand good governance. And what China is doing at the moment, it keeps giving poisonous debts that are used by African leaders for corruption, and then they keep piling up the debt. So I'll leave it there when it comes to China. But in terms of the status of democracy on the continent, in Mozambique, and the pathways for democratic revival, what I see more is a democratic closure. It's a democratic closure before consolidation. Globally, what you see in the Western world, what you see is a democratic decay, which speaks to aging population, which speaks to population which is, it has met most of the needs, social needs. But when it comes to Africa, you have a democratic closure, which speaks to authoritarianism, speaks to growing authoritarianism in a context of growing extractivism. So extractivism, it breeds authoritarianism in that leaders, African leaders, they speak to international corporations, multinationals. They don't speak to their African fellow citizens. They speak to those that come with poisonous FDIs to the continent. So that is problematic. That is problematic. In the last decade, the democratic closure decade before consolidation in the continent, in my view, speaks also to the growing extractivism in mining sector, in oil and gas, which gives revenues to non-democratic leaders that they can stay in power without accounting, without accountability and transparency. There is no demand for that. I've given the example of China, but give the examples of the major IOCs, international oil companies, the Totals, the ExxonMobils, and the Eni's. You name them. When they come, they talk to leaders, and these leaders start to get the perks. Take the example of Mozambique. 10 days before the election here, our president was given a check of $885 million in the form of a capital gains payment. That is corruption, my friend. What is corruption? It is corruption that 10 days prior to the election, the president receives a payment for a transaction. Can a government that is to face the polls in 10 days still authorize that transaction? So this president is more accountable to these multinationals and less to the population. And this, in my view, is one key factor of democratic closure. The youth, indeed, the demographic dividend, the African Union 2063 strategy, its emphasis on the youth, and rightly so, But for that, investments are needed. High quality education is needed. The quality of education in African continent is disastrous. It's disastrous. The quality of education is disastrous. You need high quality education, which is empowering, When you allow a nation to have such a bad quality education, you are condemning that nation. And African leaders, they have identified a way of perpetuating this state of affairs through keeping such a bad, disastrous education system. No investment is being made. And that, in my view, is a political instrument. It's a service of the political instruments of the African leaders. So the youth is out there. But look at Mozambique. We have 29 million people. Half are in the voting age. So roughly 14 million, of which more than 50% are young girls and boys. But you have only 1/8 of these people turning up to vote. They don't feel that the political system is supporting them. They don't see the mechanism to participate and influence the political system. So they ignore it in the form of political electoral abstention. So the third wave, it has failed, or it is failing in terms of uplifting the population and empowering the people to meaningfully participate. The youth is out there, but what about the quality of education? Is it empowering? I don't think so. So, and we see, therefore, that the youth is not participating, is being alienated. And I don't know what's going to happen in the continent in terms of political development if this state of affairs continue the way it is. without meaningful mechanism for youth, for young people to participate. In northern Mozambique, we have a conflict. And part of the narrative, they clearly point out to the fact that the youth, they have no clear mechanisms for participation. The neglect, the marginalization. So unless there is a deliberate intention to improve the mechanisms for political participation, we will see more and more youth staying away from participating, and that is problematic. When people, which supposedly they are the present and future of the nation, they stay away because the system does not create mechanisms for meaningful participation. That is problematic. With that said, I would say that centers like ours, the CDD in Mozambique, CDD in Ghana, we invest a great lot of our resources and time in youth empowerment, in the hope that that can empower them to participate as citizens, to vote, and also to stand a chance of being elected in local elections, but also to participate in businesses and in the right business, by the right business, I mean those small and medium enterprises, opportunities that they're investing in technology at the local level, that they're investing in agricultural opportunities, and give a job to people, pay the taxes, and uplift people from poverty, and moving away from illicit economic activities. This is part of our work, in the hope that it can be taken up by other groups, and gradually we can see a kind of more collective wave in the form of a fourth wave of democratic transition in our continent. Thank you very much, moderator. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. I've been going out because of my connectivity. We are now coming to the close of our, in case Professor Prempeh, of your last word.
Yes,
we are now closing.
Thank you, Gordon. This has been a very enlightening couple of hours, enlightening even if depressing, as you mentioned earlier. But I think following up on the last remarks by Adriano, clearly the third wave hasn't gone well, isn't going well. Of course, now that we have an international environment that is not the most helpful, it makes it even more difficult. There's an interesting, point that the last few comments, I think, by Adriano also raised, which is that the question of who finances our democracy, who finances our democratic governance, so to speak. It looms large in the conversation. In the past, we recall that part of the difficulty of institutionalizing democracy in Africa was the fact that our leadership, political and bureaucratic leadership, were essentially able to develop, without recourse to the people. They were able to just use the resources, natural resources, and therefore without recourse to taxation, so they didn't need to go to the people concerned to tax them and all of that. Now you are beginning to see a new version of that even those states that are not particularly resource rich, these days it's easier to go and and borrow outside of the Bretton Woods institutions, which is without conditionalities. You can cut deals with, if not China, you can even actually go to the capital markets and issue Eurobonds. So you see that with democracy, we have a very peculiar form of democracy, which is representation without taxation. A lot of the people we call voters in the African sense have no fiscal, financial kind of relationship with the state in any real formal sense. And can we build a democracy on the backs of voters who are not all taxpayers, for example? Can we build democracy on the back of an elite that doesn't have to depend on taxing the people to finance its projects, to finance its own administration even? But so if you look at in terms of there's the comparative history and evolution of democracy about principles like taxation without representation. Can we do democracy in the reverse, which is representation without taxation? Is it going to work? So these have thrown up a lot of challenges for us, but I think part of why we are in this kind of work, this line of work, is to seize these as challenges, not to throw up our hands. I like the agenda that Adriano just laid at the end, that it does mean that we have a lot of work to do. We may have taken it for granted in the early years of the transition of the wave, and now we have to face up to the real difficult task. And it means sitting back, talking, engaging in conversations like this, comparing notes across countries, and coming to some understanding of what it is that we are faced. So while depressing, I think I see in this the beginnings of, a real serious rethink of why it is that we are in this situation and what it would take. Part of which Adriano has laid down, getting to the youth, for example, issues of the youth and how we connect them, issues of education, issues of how we finance the state, taxation, and what we do about our elites that seem unwilling to finance state projects and even their own administration by going to the people for their consent and for their taxation. These are all very important questions, and I am happy that we are beginning to put all of these difficult challenges on the table in the hope and expectation that by beginning to think through this, we can evolve some common lessons and understandings that will help us all to rescue democracy, because the alternative really is worse. The alternative really is we know the alternative already. It's a very familiar alternative. And it is almost not even a distant alternative. It's actually very current in many of our countries. That's the alternative to democracy. So I think that there is no option but to do what we have to do to rescue democracy and get it on a much firmer footing than it certainly is today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Prempeh. Dr. Gorden Moyo is having some connectivity problems. So he asked me to close on his behalf. I'd like to thank Professor Kwasi Prempeh for the opening remarks, for those comments, and particularly for the partnership with CDD-Ghana Center for Democratic Development in Ghana. That's an important partnership. We will continue working together, bridging West and East Africa in a collaborative learning opportunity as a way to advance the understanding and democratic development in our continent. Much appreciation. I also like to thank Gilfred, my good friend, Gilfred from CDD-Ghana for arranging this and for bridging the two institutions. I'd also to thank Dr. Gorden Moyo for brilliantly chairing this difficult discussion, and for the comments from Zimbabwe, and also the possibility of collaboration between the two CDDs and the institute that he leads, which is the Policy Institute in Zimbabwe. CDD Mozambique would like to thank all of you, the participant, for your questions, that this is ongoing discussion. We will keep sharing as we move until we have come up with the index on democracy capture in our continent. Thank you very much. Thank my team, Sergio Musika, and the rest of my team for organizing. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
All the best. Keep safe.
Thank you.
Keep safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Jovens, em África, nós somos 600 milhões, equivalentes a 60% da população africana. Somos o maior recurso do nosso continente, o capital humano e a juventude. É em nós que se deve investir. Olá, meu nome é Dário Camal, eu sou enviado especial para a juventude da União Africana. Esta quarta-feira, dia 4 de novembro, eu vou estar com vocês no canal da CDD para debatermos a Carta Africana e o Dia da Juventude Africana, que se celebrou no dia 1 de novembro. Não percam e até lá!
Olá, nossas saudações a todas e a todos, em especial a Juventude Africana. Eu sou a Dama Balde, a vice-presidente da Rede Nacional das Nações Juvenis da Guiné-Bissau. Confirmo a minha presença no programa Jovens em Ação nesta quarta-feira, quando for às 15 horas na Guiné-Bissau, onde vamos abordar sobre a Carta Africana da Juventude e a participação dos jovens na resposta aos desafios do nosso continente. Até lá, contamos consigo.
Jovens, em África, nós somos 600 milhões, equivalentes a 60% da população africana. Somos o maior recurso do nosso continente, o capital humano e a juventude. É em nós que se deve investir. Olá, meu nome é Dário Camal, eu sou enviado especial para a juventude da União Africana. Esta quarta-feira, dia 4 de novembro, eu vou estar com vocês no canal da CDD para debatermos a Carta Africana e o Dia da Juventude Africana, que se celebrou no dia 1 de novembro. Não percam e até lá!